We're joined by Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, the Chief Scientist of the World Health Organization. Thanks very much for being with us, Dr. Swaminathan. How does the World Health Organization assess the new mutation that's found in India?
Hello, Vishnu. So the World Health Organization has obviously been following and monitoring these changes or the mutations that occur in the virus. As you know, viruses evolve, and the RNA viruses in particular are quite prone to mutations. So right from the beginning of the pandemic, this virus has been changing over a period of time. And we've set up an evolution working group that actually tracks these. In the last few months, there have been, of course, several new variants that have been reported from different countries around the world. And one of the first things that we are trying to do is to establish a nomenclature for these variants, because just because you observe a new mutation doesn't mean that it has any implications. You know, most of the mutations that the virus accumulates will have no impact at all. What we're interested in is if there is a particular set of mutations that enable it to either be more transmissible or more infectious, have any impact on clinical severity, so become, make people more ill, and thirdly, whether it has any impact on the currently available diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines. So these are the three areas that need to be studied. And so what is needed is a globally harmonized and coordinated system to track these, to have some standardized nomenclature for them, and to be able to undertake the studies that would tell us whether these variants, are impacting on any of these features. Otherwise, a mutation is a mutation, and every mutation doesn't have the same significance. So that's why we need the data. In addition to the genomic data, you also need the data coming from the epidemiological and the clinical aspects in order to put them together and make sense of it. So I think that's where we're still waiting to see these data from the variants described in India and in many other countries.
Have you asked for the data from India on the mutant strain being reported in Maharashtra?
So there is this mechanism now that's been set up, and we are in touch. The group here is in touch with the groups that are doing the genomic sequencing in India, and eventually it would be really good to have this kind of a global database. There are publicly available genomic databases, as you know, but the data needs to be complete. It needs to have this, the metadata, as I said, the clinical and the epidemiological, in order for it to make sense. So I think it's really important to put in place the mechanisms to collect that data and to make sure that it's of good quality, so that you can then interpret what these variants are actually doing.
Dr. Swaminathan,
it's not always the case that the variants have led to the increase in transmission. What we've observed in some of the European countries, what happened just before Christmas and after Christmas, was more due to behavior change of people than due to the variant itself. Of course, if you get a more transmissible virus, then that changes in behavior would actually further, make it easier for that virus to spread and really become like a super spreader kind of a thing. So both are important, the virus as well as what people are doing.
Dr. Swaminathan, is there any clarity on whether existing vaccines will work in fighting the mutation, whether it's in India or in some parts of the world? Because we've heard, for example, some vaccines are less effective, for example, in fighting the South African strain. Some are more effective. So where do we stand as far as the existing drugs are concerned?
That's really important. And, the mutations that are occurring in the spike protein region, particularly in the receptor binding domain, which is where the virus actually gets on to the receptor in the human cell, those are the critical ones. And as you pointed out, there have been some preliminary studies that show that certain mutations in that region do impact how effective the antibodies are against the virus. So whether it's from naturally acquired infection or from vaccine-induced immunity. So there are still, these studies are very preliminary. Most of the vaccine manufacturers and developers are doing these studies now with looking at the efficacy of the serum that they already have in storage from vaccinated people against these new viruses. And you can use either the variant itself, or you use something called a pseudo virion, which can be created in the lab. So this will now need to be built into all vaccine efficacy studies. There's also work that the regulatory agencies are doing. There's the Committee of the Medical Regulators Association, where the DCGI is also a member of that. They are actually looking at what data will be needed in order to approve vaccines in the future for efficacy against these different variants.
Sure.
So there'll be a set of clinical data and immunological data that developers would need to provide. The good thing is that the way the vaccine platforms now are existing, it is possible to make changes quite quickly, whether it's an mRNA platform or whether it's a viral vector platform. So it is possible to modify the vaccines. And, you know, there is a global system that does it for influenza.
Right,
and so
right.
the WHO is already setting up a system to be able to monitor and advise manufacturers on when they might need to make a change in the vaccine strain. And then, of course, there needs to be criteria of how that will be evaluated and then finally approved by the regulatory agencies.
So, in
So
fact,
that work is being
Dr.
done in
Swaminathan,
anticipation,
right? And
in
that,
case
that
there
in
is
fact,
a need really
sure.
to go into this type of vaccine changes regularly.
Yeah. That answers my next question, and I'm glad you spoke about, you know, how tweaks can be done going forward. But my next question to you is there presently a mismatch between COVID vaccine development and antiviral therapies being developed? On the one hand, we made so much progress with vaccines, but you know, antiviral therapies, what about that?
Yes, that's a very critical point, Vishnu. I'm glad you mentioned it, because everyone is so fixated on vaccines that the diagnostics and the drug development, you know, have been relatively neglected. Though I must say, in diagnostics, we've made a lot of progress, including in India with the development of, you know, some of the rapid paper-based diagnostic tests that are based on the CRISPR technology. In terms of treatments, you know, there was a lot of hope on monoclonal antibody as a good, effective treatment. What was, again, very quickly found was that the variants are able to escape the monoclonal antibodies. So what you would need are polyclonal antibodies that act on different parts of the virus surface to prevent it from binding.
Right.
So that is an early stage of development. It needs a lot of support. And I think this is where India and other, you know, middle-income countries can play a big role in expanding manufacturing capacity, both the R&D and manufacturing of monoclonals. Because in the future, monoclonals are going to be useful not only for this infection, but for lots of other infectious diseases and diseases like cancer. And that's a space that's not been really filled by the generic companies.
Right.
Similarly, for antivirals, I think that there is a need to test multiple, you know, libraries, compound libraries, to look for antiviral properties and then further take those into development. So you're absolutely right. We have only dexamethasone, which is proven to be effective in severe illness. There's some recent work showing that perhaps IL-6 inhibitors could add some value. Again, but it's very expensive. It's not easily accessible for people around the world. What we do need are treatments like antivirals that can be given earlier in the course of infection that will prevent people from getting really sick. Right. And that's an area for further research and development.
So, Dr. Swaminathan, India is set to mass vaccinate citizens through a public-private partnership. It was, in fact, it's just something that's now being slowly announced. The exact details we'll have very shortly in a couple of days. Does the WHO actually welcome that, you know, private players and the government coming together to step up the numbers of vaccinations in our country?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think vaccinating hundreds of millions of people is not a joke. It's a challenge, particularly for countries like India with large populations and, you know, a lot of heterogeneity. So we have to have an approach that uses the strengths that we have in our health system. And obviously the private sector is a major deliverer of health services. So as long as you can reach the end user with the goal of providing them, you know, at a convenient place, the vaccine, hopefully at no charge to people who cannot afford it, using the infrastructure and logistics that both the public sector and the private sector have, I think this is a good thing. Obviously, the governance and the collection of data and the tracking is going to be very, very important, and that's something I'm sure that the government has thought about and has put in place.
One final question. If India does have enough vaccine capacity, being the pharmacy of the world and the rate of manufacture and all of that, should under 50 citizens be simultaneously inoculated in a period of time, assuming that above 50s and those with comorbidities are not compromised in the vaccination process?
I think every country is, needing to prioritize, because, the first goal of vaccination in the early months should be to really protect those who are most vulnerable of getting severe illness and dying. So that's your, your frontline and healthcare workers and the people who are above a certain age. Different countries are using different cutoffs based on their own epidemiology. The people who are older also are at higher, they do have more comorbidities. And therefore, I think that's the right group to start with. And that's a huge population by itself in India. So it would be good to get started with that group. And then depending on the pace and, how things progress, it could then be opened up to other groups. Later on, one want to vaccinate a larger percentage of the population to achieve that population immunity. But I think the first goal is really to protect those and completely reduce the deaths due to this infection.
Dr. Swaminathan, just before I leave you, one final question, because it keeps coming up. What about children? At the moment, none of these vaccines are meant to be administered to children. When will we start administering these to those below the age of 18?
That's a good question again. And many of the vaccine developers are now beginning their studies in children. So, the initial vaccine trials were all done in people above 18, most of them. So now they're going down to the age of 12 to 18, and then perhaps would go further down to the age between 6 and 12. So you need to establish the safety and the immunogenicity and the dose of the vaccine that needs to be given in these children to achieve the same, levels of antibodies and immune response. And then, of course, there's the modeling work that's being done to see, what benefits there will be to immunizing young children. We know, for example, that children under 10 are less likely to get the infection and less likely to pass it on. So it may be that children over 10 are prioritized. But you need firstly the safety and the dosing and immunogenicity data. And then you also need to first make sure that you've covered the entire adult population.
One last question. I'm sorry to keep you waiting. It's just fascinating speaking to you. Should traditional medication such as Patanjali's Coronil, which was sort of being rolled out over here, be considered as a line of COVID treatment?
Well, Vishnu, for the treatment of COVID, as you know, from the beginning, there's been a lot of hype and hope on many different medicines. Many of them were repurposed drugs that have been used to treat other infectious diseases, antimalarials, other antivirals, and so on. And there was hope. These were put through clinical trials, and most of them, were found really not to live up to the expectations. So one has to go through these robust, well-designed, and large enough randomized clinical trials, whether it's for prevention of the infection or if it's for early disease or if it's for more severe disease. You need to also, look at which group you're targeting with these medications and then be able to demonstrate a benefit. So regardless of whether it's a traditional medicine or whether it's an allopathic medicine, I think the same rules apply to all. And I think the use of any medication obviously needs to be evidence-based and data-driven.
All right, Dr. Swaminathan, thank you very much for speaking to us. Lots of information over there on the road ahead and where the world stands in this battle at this stage.
Thank you.